Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon, and even though we've just finished a big old discussion, we are back to talk about the rotation that is happening for the new standard format in the 2017-18 format. As we know, it is Primal Clash, Double Crisis, Roaring Skies, and Ancient Origins that are all on the chopping board, making way for fresh decks in future, and today me and Jack are going to be talking about the impact this is going to have on the current decks we have in Standard and potential other decks going forward. So, let's have a look at what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, so what's on the agenda? We've got an overview of just what rotation is, what the big impacts are, really. And then going to look at the specific big losses, all of the big cards that see a lot of play already. Then we're going to look at some old favourites, some cards that maybe haven't seen too much play lately, but have been in top tier archetypes, or at least played around with since they're in their time in the standard format. And then finally, we're going to look at all of the good decks right now, including some new ones from Burning Shadows, and how these decks are going to adapt to the BKT-ON format, what they lose, what they gain, what matchups that maybe, what things change for these matchup-wise, things like that. So we're going to look at all of that stuff in today's video. It's going to be a long old discussion.
So, just to clarify once again, rotation is something that happens every year. It's something that just keeps the game fresh so that we don't have way too many sets to play with, and it just means that they have more creativity space in future sets, because otherwise there can be broken combos just because of a card that was printed 2 years ago. It can stop them. It basically confines their design space for future cards, so it keeps the format moving along and hopefully steers it into a good direction where we can have a nice healthy format like we have at the moment. So it's just pretty nice, and additionally we're having the quarterly ban list being introduced. Although it will be used sparingly in Standard, it's something to bear in mind, because it just means that they are monitoring the game a little bit more closely to ensure that it's, you know, a fun and fair game for everyone, basically. And once again, reiterating that Primal Clash, Double Crisis, Roaring Skies, and Ancient Origins are the ones to go.
Yeah. So the big picture, this is every single relevant card in our eyes that's leaving the format. We're not going to sit and read through all of these. We've bolded the ones that are particularly relevant right now in the standard format. So give this a pause real quick if you want to have a look at everything going. Pretty much everything in bold plus more we're going to be talking about in relative detail today. So if you've just want a quick look, here's that for you. But if you want to hear about these cards individually, stay tuned, because we're going to be talking about, I'd say, probably 70% of the cards on this list already.
Yeah. So, setting up for the future, rotation keeps all the break sets together, which is a logical thing to do rather than splitting them up. It also means that it's likely that we'll get a Sun and Moon on in the next year, because they'll be rotating out the rest of the XY block. So something to bear in mind when we start thinking about the future of the game, and maybe if there's newer players who are looking to invest into decks, and you want to know what's most likely to happen for next rotation. It's strange that one's just been announced and we're already looking at the one for the next season, but this is probably the most logical answer for what rotation will be in the following year, so keep that in mind for your own investments.
Yeah. So a quick summary. This is just the real key points and what key cards are leaving. Shaman EX rotates. Whilst it's been seeing a little bit less play lately, it's still a really, really influential loss to a lot of decks. VS Seeker and Trainer's Mail are two very, very popular cards. Again, seeing a little bit less play due to Garbodor right now, but still staples in probably 90% of decks, at least VS Seeker is. So, you know, these are really, really big losses. Vileplume and Forest, a lot of people will be happy to see at least Vileplume, if not Forest as well, go. So that's going to hurt grass types on the whole. And then as far as archetypes plus some really key Pokemon, Evolution, the evolutions that all give Stage 1s their respective type, leave Standard, as well as Mega Ray and Vesp as decks. The whole archetype leaves for those. So yeah, whilst it's only 3 main sets, it's still a pretty big rotation, because we lose a lot of key cards, as well as some pretty top tier archetypes.
Definitely. And here's a few more general trends about how we feel the format is going to shape up and what it's going to be like to play in this sort of format. In general, it's probably going to get a little bit slower because we don't have aggressive cycle through Trainer's Mail, Acrobike. We can't VS Seeker back supporters to guarantee like the specific ones we want on every single turn. Maybe it tends us more towards a heavier Lele count. And of course we lose Shaman EX, so we can't cycle 20 or 30 cards per turn, for now at least. Again, reiterating that Forest is going. Grass types have been dominant, especially Decidueye, but there's also been like Vespiquen, and that also exits the format, so much less focus on the grass archetypes, I think, is going to be something that's very important to note, and also it's probably the most popular item lock we have currently. It might have to contend with Noivern, but for now at least it feels like Vileplume is the most oppressive, most awkward item lock deck, and that is now going, so it pretty much means everyone's going to be allowed to play the game, which is a really good thing, and you're not just going to be locked out from turn 1 unless you are up against these like Noiverns, and even then it can't be turn 1 anymore, and we'll discuss reasons for that later on. Many Ball Search cards are leaving. This is quite awkward for some evolution decks. Some get hurt more than others. Things like Raichu Bat's very reliant on things like Level Ball. Things like Greninja very reliant on Dive Ball, Level Ball, Repeat Ball. So that also could be awkward. And it does mean that potentially Vulpix becomes an even more important starter in decks, because that beacon attack has proven itself to be very strong and will continue to be a crutch for some evolution decks. I think for me the biggest difference in the format is the lack of Hex Maniac now. People just splash the one card into their deck alongside VS Seekers and think, okay, I can have a shot against these very ability-reliant decks, and that is no longer going to be the case. So if you're not playing Garbodor, you can't stop your opponent doing abilities now, and that is going to really shape the format and make abilities once again as powerful as they should be. And this is something to definitely keep note of when we start talking about some archetypes in a minute. And again, the evolutions, this is sort of something that gets thrown in with a bunch of stage 1s. So stage 1s in general lose a bit of value as well, because they can't hit for weakness on all sorts of different things. Now they are just their own type and hitting for weakness for that. So some interesting trends overall.
Yeah. So we've talked about sort of the general impact. Let's look at some specific cards now. These are the big cards that we're losing. These are, I think, cards are all going to be cards that people will miss in some capacity. All cards that see a lot of play right now. Starting off with, of course, Shaman EX. Shaman has been a staple since release. It's a card that a lot of people immediately picked up 4 of, and it were never really punished for, because the setup ability is so strong. It was used as a 4 in certain archetypes, things like Ray, things like Guardy have even used 4 of this card. It's that strong. Without it, this format will inherently slow down. Like Joe said, we can't cycle 30 to 40 cards on our first turn just through Ultra Balls and Shamans and strong supporters, and not worrying about what we throw away because we've got all this recovery back. So I think the format is definitely going to take a step back and a step in the slower direction. We did get Lele printed, so we still can be relatively aggressive. We can still always find that turn 1 Sycamore, that kind of thing. But I think in general, even though Shaman has begun seeing less play on the whole compared to Lele, it's still a really, really impactful loss, and it's a card that I think will be notably missing in the format come September the 1st.
Definitely a big impact card in terms of prize racing, in terms of setting up your initial turns, and just decks in general that wouldn't function without Shaman. Think about Mega Evolution decks, so reliant on Hooper to find their Pokemon and also draw cards for the rest of their turn. I think Megas in general lose a lot from Shaman rotating, just in the fact that Hooper can't grab this card as well as their attackers now, so a big impact for sure for a whole bunch of decks, even Decidueye, although that loses a bunch of things. Combo decks like these were pretty much made possible because of Shaman, so now we'll be seeing much less crazy combo decks, in my opinion. Then we have VS Seeker and Trainer's Mail also exiting. VS Seeker being like a 3 or 4 of in almost every deck. Trainer's Mail used to be a 3 or 4 of in a bunch of decks, but since Garbodor it's got a little bit less, but still in my opinion one of the best cards we've seen for a long time. A really, really impactful item for, again, finding your combos, hitting important cards, and making sure that you can actually play the game, because you can dig into a supporter or an Ultra Ball on your first turn at the very least, and keeping you consistent. So again, it sort of leads toward Tapu Lele becoming the 3 or the 4 of that we've seen in a few lists. That's going to be just more commonplace, I feel, because we're going to have to play higher counts of physical supporters now that VS Seeker's gone. Seeing counts of like 3 Guzma is going to be a commonplace thing, I believe, and also it means that one of supporters become much less reliable and much less useful for us because we can't reuse them on the specific turns that they're good. And this also sort of makes... I think only Bridget will be like the only one-off supporter that we play now, because there'll be... It's too awkward for you to like not be able to access it on the turns you need it, and it's so likely that you can draw into it and not use it that turn, but need to have it back in the deck for you to Lele later. So it just makes no sense to play it when you don't have VS Seeker. So we're going to see higher supporter counts in decks physically, higher Lele counts to sort of balance out the fact that we don't have VS Seeker anymore. And also a big point is that VS Seeker was like 80 damage for a Garbodor a lot of the time, and Trainer's Man additionally could be an extra like 40 damage throughout the game. So when these staple item cards are going out the format, it may spell trouble for Garbodor because decks are naturally not playing these cards anymore and therefore are less vulnerable to big old Trasher launches. So that's, again, a hidden thing that we have to bear in mind when we're talking about archetypes in a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. These two items have always been impactful since they've been in format, so I think, again, they're definitely going to be missed. And like we say, Bridget's probably one of the only supporters that can stay as that one count in a deck nowadays, simply because it's good on the first turn. It's very, very weak on later turns, so you don't mind if you don't hit it first turn, you don't mind having to Sycamore it away later on because you're unlikely to use it again. But things, even though Hex is rotating, Hex, for example, wouldn't be a very good one-of anymore, because if you can't VS Seeker it on the turn that you need to, you're very unlikely to be able to find that Hex or whatever on the specific turn you need without having to guarantee finding a Lele, and it's a lot more difficult to do than rather just VS Seeker it back into play. So yeah, really impactful losses. Next up, we have Forest of Giant Plants and Vileplume. Two cards that I think a lot of people will be happy to see go. Forest opens so many doors for grass types, both stage 1s and stage 2s. It was seen in things like Vespiquen and upcoming Galissapod, but also stage 2s like Vespi Vile played it, Decidueye Vileplume. All of these grass types just cheated their way up to stage 2s on the first turn of the game and really put on some pressure. So I think a lot of people will be happy to see, more than anything, Vileplume go. I still kind of like Forest as a card, but I think it was just poorly timed releasing Vileplume at the same time. But both are going either way. It's going to be back to rare candy style engines for stage 2s, just because, again, they can't cheat their way out, which means things like Decidueye are going to have to adapt their lists to be more to be able to deal with this loss of Forest. We don't know for sure. We have predictions, and we're going to talk about Decidueye later on, but we don't know for sure whether it'll even survive post Forest being rotated. It's still a very strong card, so I think it's likely to in some capacity. I think we're going to move away from heavy Decidueye decks and see it more as a support kind of engine. And then regarding Vileplume itself, turn 1 item lock is so much more difficult. We actually only have two relevant quote-unquote item lockers in the format once Vileplume leaves, and that's Noivern GX and Hoot Hoot. Noivern GX is actually really difficult to get turn 1 plume off because you need turn 1 item lock off because you need Wally plus a way to attach your second energy as well as your first energy, considering we lose DDE. So Noivern is a very difficult combo to get turn 1, and when you're losing a lot of combo cards like Trainer's Mail and Shaman, it's not a good place for turn 1 item lock, which is a good thing. And then the other one is Hoot Hoot, which, sure, it's only a DCE away, but if you're playing Hoot Hoots and DCEs in your deck, it's a very frail Pokemon, so it's not going to be a particularly good choice. The fact that Vileplume was so strong was because it was a bench sitter, so it forced resources for your opponent to deal with it. Whereas if you're leaving a Hoot Hoot in the active with a DCE on it, all your opponent needs to do is respond with a Lele DCE, and they've been able to counter your item lock. You're going to have to work again to be able to keep up that item lock. So yeah, it's not looking good for item lock, but I think that's not a bad thing. We've had item lock in the format for pretty much 4 or 5 years solid now, with Vileplume plus Seismitoad being rotated last year. We've had a lot of item lock for the past few years, so maybe it's time to just take a step back from item lock for a year or so. I don't think Pokemon ever will. I think it wouldn't surprise me if we saw something similar in the not too distant future, but maybe Noivern has capped that for now.
Yeah, for a small window of time, we are actually able to set up every game, as long as your own deck is cooperating with you. Your opponent can't lock out a third or a fourth of your deck all on one turn without you being able to draw a card anymore, and that can only be a good thing for the format. I agree that in general, grass decks take a hit. It's not just the Decidueye, it's also Galissapod. Vespiquen is going anyway, but that also played a couple of counts, and yeah, it just really limits the grass archetype. Everyone sort of looks at every single grass Pokemon when the new sets come out, and that's because people are thinking forest means even bad stage 2s can be good because we can cheat, and that's no longer going to be the case, and it actually means that grass is left with like no support at all anymore. So yeah, those sorts of archetypes seem to be diminishing. Another big one is, as I was just mentioning, Vespiquen is getting taken away, which is one of the best non-EX decks in format. I believe there's only a couple of non-EX decks that will have post-rotation that seem to be very strong. I think Greninja's the big one that stands out in my mind right now, and potentially the non-GX version of Alolan Ninetales. But from there, we're going to have very GX-heavy metagame and still some EX decks as well. So that's interesting to see that one of the biggest sort of glass cannon attackers will be leaving the format. Unknown has been obviously used in Vespi, but has more recently been used even in things like Mega Rayquaza with the Mallow combo, which has been cool to see. And for me, I'm quite sad about the Stage 1 evolutions leaving. I know it's kind of ridiculous that one Pokemon can hit for 4 weaknesses, especially because ×2 is such a ridiculous advantage that you gain over people. But it just meant that Stage 1s, there was a reason to play Stage 1s, and I believe because they were frail, because you normally only played like a 1 count of each evolution, it was still kind of fair because your opponent can target it down and just KO it, or they could still develop Garbodor and shut down the ability and such. So I liked the fact that it gave a boost to Stage 1s and it forced us to play evolution cards because it's so inherently good to play basic Pokemon. It's just a fact. You commit less slots in your deck, so you have more space for consistency. You can attach to it turn 1 in a safe place rather than having low HP Pokemon. There's so many reasons why basics are good. The fact that there was something incentivizing Stage 1s, I feel, was a good thing for the format and is good for creativity. And that is going to be stifled now because Stage 1s have to be broken on their own because they don't have the same support that they're used to.
Yeah, it meant that some of these more niche Stage 1 attackers that maybe only had okay attacks actually still saw play because they could take on these 3 other types and actually hit 2 or 3 popular archetypes for weakness. I think, like you say, Vespiquen is a very glass cannon deck, but has always been pretty top tier archetype, so it's going to be sad to see one of these stronger non-EX decks go. I'm not as sold on Greninja being good post-rotation. I think it's still got potential, but I'm not quite sold on it yet. But we're going to be looking at these other decks that naturally have a broken aspect about them, rather than just Vespi being a super quick and semi-reliable way of being able to prize trade. So that's definitely going to be missed. And yeah, I think my biggest loss, other than the main things like Shaman and VS Seeker, the biggest loss and the loss I'm the most sad about is the evolutions, because like you say, they did bring a lot of creativity to the format. And I'd love to see effects like this again at some point. So hopefully Pokemon are listening out there, and we see, at least not in the too distant future, some kind of similar effect, because I think it's a really, really creative effect. Next up, we have Hexmaniac, Lysander, and Teammates. These are 3 really big cards that leave. 3 very strong, quote-unquote, tech supporters. I mean, Lysander wasn't a tech supporter. It was pretty much a staple in the majority of archetypes. But you know what I mean. These aren't your Ends or your Sycamores, but they're still really, really strong. Garbodor is our only ability lock now, and can be removed with Field Blower. So it's going to mean, as we mentioned earlier on, abilities are pretty much ripe for the abusing right now. There's some really good abilities that Garbodor and Hex have both pushed out of the format up until at least Field Blower was released. Now Field Blower is out. There's been a few more cool abilities creeping out of the woodwork, things like Vikavolt and that kind of thing. But with only Garbodor being with Garbodor being the only ability lock, I think we're going to see more of these abilities come out of the binder and make their way into decks, because it's going to mean you have you're never locked completely for a turn. You couldn't turn Hexmaniac off, whereas if you're able to find Field Blower, which can easily sort of bump your counts up, you're not running Trainer's Mail anymore, so maybe you're going to be running a 2-3 count of Field Blower now. You can find these Field Blowers when you need them and be able to get your abilities back online. It's going to be a really, really interesting format where abilities actually seem like they're going to be super strong. And it's, even though Hex is a good card for holding back some of these decks like Volk and Greninja. I actually hope we don't see anything like this reprinted, at least for a little while, just so we can have these abilities shine for a while. Lysander has been kind of replaced by Guzma, but has served the format well. It's been a 1-2 of in pretty much every deck since its release, if not more in some of these disruption decks. Guzma does seem to be, in general, a slightly more useful card because you get that extra switching effect if you do Lysander a Pokemon up. But it's worth noting that we won't have Lysander anymore. We will have to have a way to retreat back into our attacker if that's the case, using Guzma. And I think it's worth noting, even though Guzma is being released right about now, Lysander has definitely served the format well. And then finally, teammates. It is one of the best post-knockout recovery we've had. It's very similar to Twins. Some people say it's better, some people say it's worse. I think it's a real loss for this format, losing teammates, especially as it's seeing more play because of Lele right now. You can Lele into your teammates. It's less impact, whilst it's a very big card. Considering we're losing VS Seeker, it's one of these one-off supporters, so it's probably not as impactful in general because we're losing VS Seeker as well. If this had been a year earlier, maybe we'd have more to say about this, but it's still a card that's seen a lot of play and still sees play now, and I think is a very, very good recovery card. I'd love a card like this again in the format just because it kind of takes me back to the Heart Gold Soul Silver era, and it's very reminiscent of that kind of effect.
Yeah, I really like search cards to guarantee things rather than digging cards because it just feels so much better, and it feels like you can actually plan out turns and your next few turns if you can guarantee cards rather than just dig and hope. So those sorts of effects I would like to see more of in the game. It's a shame that this one's leaving. Maybe it's time for Alolan Muck to start finally seeing play, now that pretty much it's him and Garbodor as the only bros that can lock down abilities. But even Muck, even though he is a constant ability lock, he's only locking basic Pokemon. Obviously Silent Lab goes, so he sort of steps in that role, but at the same time, the majority of abilities are from evolved Pokemon, the likes of Gardy, Metagross, Vikavolt, and Greninja. It's only really Volcanion that you can sort of stop dead with Muck, but at the same time, it's not really dead because they can just KO it at any point anyway. So, yeah, ability lock also becoming much less powerful. It just means that it feels like the format is in a place where you can't ability lock consistently and you can't item lock at all. So pretty much every deck is now just going to be setting up its own approach pretty much every game and just seeing which setup is strongest. So that's going to be interesting to see. We may be seeing naturally the slower progression of the format with the Shaman, but also because your opponent is much less likely to prevent you doing what you want to do with your own deck, it comes down to being as consistent as possible whilst carrying out the most broken ability that you can abuse, basically. So that's going to be a pretty interesting thing to see what comes out on top when Item Lock and Hex is removed from the format. Mega Rayquaza is completely obliterated. It loses, the Mega Ray itself, and you also lose Skyfield and all that other stuff. Shaman. Even if the Mega Ray itself wasn't being rotated, it would still never see play anymore because Skyfield, Shaman go anyway. So the archetype's gone. I'm super happy to see Ray leave. I have always hated this archetype. Never liked playing it because I always draw terrible, but then whenever you see it in a tournament, someone somehow gets the 240 turn 1 against you, and you're just like, wow, come on, really? It's one of these wombo combo decks. It's almost like a Yu-Gi-Oh deck where you just sort of draw 30 cards turn 1 because you can, and hit big numbers with even bigger like HP and stuff. So I'm so happy to see Ray going. I know we have Sudowoodo right now, so in theory you can choose to never lose to Rayquaza, but it just seems to be this rogue deck at the moment. It's in sort of the tier list where its power level is immense, but it'll never be a top tier archetype because of the one card counter people can play. It's just one of these things that sort of dips in popularity here and there when the time is right, and when no one's thinking about Ray, it just comes in and destroys a tournament by taking 6 prizes in 3 turns every single round. So I'm so glad that this is going. I don't think this was a healthy deck for the game, and it just, again, opens up pathways for tanking decks once again, which is really cool, and hopefully is something we'll see more of. Skyfield exiting also means that Rainbow Force loses a bunch. It can still get one-hit KOs without the Skyfield, thanks to dual types, but it is, again, neutered, especially because it can't play Shaman, and Trainer's Mail, and the deck is inherently already very inconsistent, so I believe that also loses a bunch. And the Raichu archetypes as well. Raichu Bats has seen play here and there. I believe earlier on in its career it was a genuine archetype, mainly because Bats was so good when we had Crobat, and it was good for like Night March and stuff. I remember playing it at one Nationals, and yeah, that going is kind of okay too. Raichu also found himself as like sometimes a partner for Vespiquen. I remember early on that was a thing. He even found himself into like Virgin a while back, so like he's been in all sorts of decks, and finally he will also be rotating. And Mega Turbo going as well. So all the other Megas that stay in format lose one of the key cards for the archetypes themselves, and that they can't accelerate anymore. So the fact that Mega Turbo and Hooper gets way worse because it can only find the physical Pokemon and not Shaman to draw cards. I believe Megas pretty much rotate themselves, even if they're still physically in the format, personally.
Yeah, Megas take a big hit. Ray's one of those decks that kind of is a one-sided deck. You do all of your things, and if you can't then deal with what the Ray player has presented, they will take 6 prizes. So, yeah, I agree. It's not a healthy archetype. And again, I've always been on the receiving end of the 240 rather than being able to Emerald Break turn 1 and see my opponent flip the table instead. So, yeah, I'm happy to see a Ray go. Skyfield leaving does, like you say, stem things like Rainbow Force and Raichu. Both of these are still going to be archetypes within the format, but I don't think they're viable at all. I don't think they're going to have the damage to keep up with the ever-increasing HP of GXs, especially as they're losing the kind of thing that they're losing 60 damage. Well, Raichu's losing 60 damage, and Rainbow Force is losing 90 damage based on just losing Skyfield, so that's pretty unfortunate. 2 non-EX decks that, again, I haven't been too much of a fan of. Rainbow Force, in my eyes, is just non-EX Ray. So I'm kind of happy to see Rainbow Force taking a hit. But Raichu's always a cool card. But again, it's also losing Level Ball, so there's really no hope for Raichu, I don't think. And then Mega Turbo is the last nail in the coffin for Megas, I think. Hooper is the only saving grace right now for Megas. I don't think there's a nice way of being able to make a consistent Mega list without Mega Turbo plus Shaman. Shaman is very, very important. One of the only decks that me and Joe have played, Mega decks that me and Joe have played that hasn't run Mega Turbo was Guardy with Elixirs, and Guardy needs Shaman to survive. So I can't see too much space for Megas right now. But that being said, maybe Megas are the balance in between these Stage 2 GXs that are insanely powerful and the current speed of the format right now. Maybe Megas are just quick enough to be able to compete. So maybe they still have legs. Unfortunately, I don't think so, though. Next up, we have Gyarados and Magma's Secret Base. Gyarados has obviously proved itself in such unfavorable formats over the past year, winning regionals in formats where people have teched against Gyarados. Alex Dow is the big mention here. I think he took on in Birmingham he took on so many Gyarados counters and came out on top. So clearly this is an archetype that has legs and will always be remembered, but unfortunately it is time to go. Again, it's another non-EX archetype that we're losing, similar to Vespi. So we're going to be looking again more towards EXs and GXs, this 2-prize format again. Magma Base has seen a lot more play, not only in Gyarados, but Drampa GX has started to use it as well. I've noticed I've called it Hidden Base on the slide. That's not what it's called. But, you know, it's a big loss for... I think it's one of the easiest ways of being able to hit that turn 2 Berserk. So we're going to be looking at Rainbow Energy and Po-Town as the damage method of choice nowadays. Rainbow Energy is a bit more awkward if you're not playing Elixirs. It makes it a lot more difficult to hit that turn 2 Berserk. So Po-Town is probably one of the more consistent ones, being able to evolve your own Garb and take that 3 damage to set up your turn 2 Berserk. Will probably be where this archetype goes in my mind.
Yeah, I like Po-Town anyway. I think as soon as it comes into the format, I'll be playing over Secret Base in my Garbodor variants. My Drampa variants, because evolutions are just getting better. So it sort of feels like it, again, the base is naturally rotating out, and Gyarados had his place in the spotlight, and I know a few people who are personally going to really be sad when this goes. And yeah, it's an archetype that I was terrible at playing, so I don't mind that this is gone because I don't have to worry about playing it, and people can take out their one-of counter cards now just because I don't want to get absolutely wrecked by this powerful non-EX Pokemon. We also lose lots of ball search, and really impactful ball search, I think. Level ball has been great for a long time. This was a card that I was so happy to see return, I remember. And again, it's just one of these sad moments where we have to say goodbye to it for a second time, and it's such a shame for me because it's such a nice card. Again, it incentivized stage 1 and 2 decks, and seeing it go is kind of awkward. Dive Ball has been immense for evolving the Greninja archetype and making that very consistent. The fact that Greninja loses, you know, the 7 ball cards that it plays in its list is really grim for you. That's 7 slots that are really necessary for you to get multiple Greninjas out, so seeing where that sort of fills the gaps when we only have things like Timer Ball left is going to be really grim to see how Greninja evolves. Even Repeat Ball was a card that also went into Greninja. I believe I played it in a couple of my bat lists as well early on. And it was in the round archetype as well, which is quite fun. So Repeat Ball's seen some play here and there. And then Rough Seas has been a really nice card. I remember this being crazy good with Mega Manectric when it first hit the scenes. It's been really good to counter Trevenant Break at times. The Aquabox archetype at Worlds with Toad. Straight Toad even played this. Not Night March, what was I going to say? This has just seen play basically forever, and a potion on everything every turn is just so good for you. So I think for current decks, it's kind of annoying for the new Lapras style of Aquabox. It's also annoying for Quad Lapras. And to an extent, Alolan Ninetales that can sometimes play a couple of these as well. So this is a big loss because it is a very, very powerful stadium and has seen play in a bunch of different decks.
Yeah, it's such a simple stadium, but healing up to 180 damage per turn is insane, just as just a stadium card. So it's definitely going to be missed. It's always been a stadium that people have considered if they're running these water and lightning types. So it's definitely a big loss. And then the 3 ball cards we lose. I think it's really unfortunate to see cards like this stay. To see these cards lost. I really want these kind of cards to stay. Things like Ultra Ball have solidified their place in the format. They're getting reprinted every 3 or 4 sets to set it up for future rotations. And I feel like things, maybe not Dive Ball because it's type specific, but things like Heavy Ball and Level Ball, I'd love to see these stay with things like Ultra Ball, just because they're really good cards to have. I think they're very staple in setting up decks. So yeah, it's very, very sad to see these cards go again. All of these cards have been very useful in top tier archetypes. So we're going to be definitely looking forward to seeing some new ball cards come out soon to hopefully keep these decks consistent. We're losing, like I say, we're losing Trainer's Mail plus Shaman plus these ball cards. Decks are going to have to run higher counts of the cards they want to see, just because it's not going to be anywhere near as easy to find them out nowadays. So some old favorites. We've talked about all of the cards that we know are useful now and we're going to miss. But we just wanted to have a quick shout out to some of these cards that we've seen play in the past. You know, they may not be good right now, but they've made top tier performances in the past, maybe done well at nationals, things like this. So just a quick shout out to a few cards down the line. Kicking us off is the Dragon Box. Giratina, Reshiram, Hydreigon, and Double Dragon Energy all leave. There was a while in the format or in the set releases where dragons were all Pokemon were pushing really, and that was this block. Giratina saw a lot of play with Seismitoad. The Renegade Pulse ability was really annoying for Megadex, and then Chaos Wheel locking out 3. A very strange combination of cards, but it was actually a really, really annoying set of combination of cards. Special Energy was the big one. So we will be losing Giratina, locking down these awkward cards. Noivern semi replaces this whilst DDE is still in format. If we ever want to play a Giratina style deck again, but Noivern also loses DDE, so it's probably only good until rotation anyway. Reshiram actually made Turbo Tina an option, a deck that me and Joe have both kind of had fun with, trying to get that turn 1 Chaos Wheel off through Turbo Blazing multiple times and then moving around with Dragon Road and switching and then finishing the turn off by announcing Chaos Wheel and feeling really, really proud that you managed to attach 4 energy in a turn. Hydreigon meant that you didn't have to rely on Floatstone in these kind of decks, and even in Darkrai Dragons, because you were running DDE, it meant that you could actually throw up something like, just your Dragon type, and provided you had a Stadium in play, you didn't have to worry about having to find a Floatstone and waste this tool slot on a Tina or whatever. You could just free retreat. And then finally, DDE kind of made all of these decks function. None of these decks would be good without DDE because Dragon type Pokemon's attack costs are so awkward. So I think the biggest loss on this page is DDE. Again, it's another card that I wouldn't mind seeing stay in play, a bit like Double Colorless, unless they start bringing out another archetype that can push Dragon types. But unfortunately, as I kind of predicted, we haven't seen a DDE reprint, and I don't think we will for a little while. So for now, Dragons still have this awkward attack, all of these awkward attack costs, and are also weak to a very, very popular type in the format. So Dragons, along with Grass types, are taking a pretty big hit from this rotation.
Yeah, Dragons get hit real hard, and the worst thing is Burning Shadows has a few Dragon type cards out there, Noivern being the most notable one, and it has no indication that it can survive post DDE. It is having a Psychic and Dark Energy cost, so it needs DDE to survive, and it's just going. So I actually think it will come back pretty soon, seeing as though they plan ahead, these sets. It's not like they just do one at a time. They actually think about the format of the game, and they think maybe if they knew DD was going in a rotation, that they would start printing some Dragons with better attack costs, even if they're all colorless costs like they used to be, because they used to be colorless Pokemon, and just having one colored energy here and there. They've just not gone for that. They've said, you know what, we'll keep these Dragons with awkward energy costs and just roll with it. So I think DD might become a card like DCE that's going to be constantly reprinted, because it feels like Dragon types are just sort of labeled with this awkward energy cost. So I feel it eventually has to come back. It's so. Just I feel like it's a matter of sets, and as you say, for now their weakness is already a huge limiting factor for them. So they can print really broken Dragons right now, and I feel like printing double Dragon energy doesn't make Dragons broken, because they'll always have the check of having Fairy weakness right now. So currently, basically, Dragons just all go in the binder, and I even think that's the case for Noivern. It loses so much with the loss of DDE. Just such an impactful card, and yeah, Dragons are basically the worst type in the game now. Primal Groudon is something that has seen a lot of play in both Expanded and Standard because of that amazing ancient trait. Just being so awkward to deal with. It's again uninteractive, where you just sort of sit building and your opponent can't affect it in any way, and it gets big one-hit knockouts once he's finally ready to go. A really interesting way to play the game, and I think a lot of people loved those players who did play Groudon loved playing Groudon, because it's just such a different feel to every other deck. You can be so safe in planning out your next 3 turns, and you can see the win condition that your opponent literally can't prevent. So it was a really cool archetype. And yeah, it was a real cool setup decks in the format, full of EXs, as you can see there. And I'm also a little bit sad that the Regirock is leaving. I played a quad Regirock deck, and I've got points with it. And even recently, I've splashed it as a 1 count into Xerneas Break, and it found its way into Pancakes and a few other things, just as a little bench sitter with a tool on. And unfortunately, he's going to be leaving us as well. Steven is going to be leaving also. Not many decks played Steven. It was only really, I think there was a Nationals Groudon list that made top 8 that played Steven. But that's really the only time we've seen Steven to any success. But yeah, Primal Groudon going, and shout out to most of the ancient traits. They are all pretty much leaving the format, leaving very few remaining just from a few promo cards, I believe.
Yeah, I'm pretty sad to see Groudon go. I never got to play Groudon. I really, really wish I'd played it back in London for the internationals. I probably would have ended with a better record, but hey ho. Hindsight is such a nice thing. I'm really, really sad to see Groudon go. It's such an uninteractive Pokemon. It's a horrible Pokemon to play against, but I think it's one of those Pokemon that you just would love to play with, and just be able to set up this board where you Gaia Volcano 3 times and you just win because your opponent hasn't been able to Lysander or E-Hammer or any of this kind of annoying stuff. you get to punish the annoying decks by being an even more annoying deck yourself. It's such a cool archetype. So yeah, I'm pretty sad to see Primal Groudon go. And I've also got a playset of Regirock in my binder that also I haven't been able to play with, which is pretty sad. But one day we'll get expanded tournaments over in Europe again, and I'll be able to rock Primal Groudon or Regirock somewhere.
Bring back Frog Reggie. That's what I say.
Yeah. Next up, the other Primal Kyogre, one that I have played around with a little bit more. Again, it hasn't seen play recently, but back when it was first released, 240 HP was monstrous. Tidal Storm was a really, really strong attack against EXs. You did 150, and then you sort of set up the rest of your opponent's EXs to be able to take 4 prizes next turn. Tidal Storming again. Alpha Growth was a really, really strong ancient trait to have. I think it's one of the strongest and most underrated ones. Unfortunately, it just never really saw enough play as the format moved on. Other water types around this time, Articuno has been a Pokemon that people have started to splash in a little bit more, being able to swing prize trades against things like Froakie and Rowlet, all of these kind of awkward Pokemon, basic Pokemon that your opponent plays. You can take a cheeky extra prize on them and start treating them as EX, which is really cool. Plus, you can actually still take that bonus prize on an EX you've set up in the earlier turns, which is really, really nice. So yeah, I think that's actually one of the more impactful losses for things like Aquabox. And Regice, since we've seen Ranger plus some other cards being released since, including the GXs, Resistance Blizzard has lost a lot of value. But that being said, there was a time things like Vilebox were pretty reliant on this card in certain matchups, so it's definitely worth noting that these kind of annoying resistance effects are, at least one of them, we still have Glaceon and Jolteon, but at least one of them is rotating out come September.
Yeah, it's a bit sad. I think for me, Articuno is the biggest loss. It's a pretty cool card. I mean, you never really like seeing a card that is so reliant on coin flips, but at the same time, being able to really tempo out and prey on slower, grindy decks, I feel like it would be something that could be amazing in the format. As we've just said, Shaman's going, lots of Ball Searchers going, and there's lots of evolutions in format. I feel like it's perfectly poised for Articuno to be within that format, just to prey on these sorts of things and try and swing the prize race before the game even gets going. So that's a big loss for me. And Primal Groudon, I believe I played... Primal Kyogre, I believe I played in like one tournament and did horribly with. So that can go in the bin. That's fine. Next up, a couple of EX Pokemon that have found their way into decks here and there. Lugia EX has pretty much been replaced with Tapu Lele. Notably, it still was the one slot in John Kettler's most recent list of Decidueye Plume, even though Lele was released. Mainly due to his second attack also being very valuable. Lugia's also found play in the Tina Hammers list as the backup attacker. So Lugia's seen a good amount of play here and there. Trevenant EX hasn't seen a huge amount of play. I remember it being in one of the... I believe it was the Canadian Nationals. I don't think it won the tournament. I think it was like a top 4 in a Mega Manectric deck. So that was pretty cool because you wanted to hit for weakness on Greninja, which is just a really random thing that popped into my head. But I remember that's probably the heights of Trevenant EX's play. It's also been in early renditions of Decidueye as a cool one-of attacker. And yeah, that's a pretty cool thing. But he's not going to see play anyway, so like he sort of rotates himself because of the Scoop Ups, the Acerolos, and the Guzmas that have come out from the new format. So it's not really that we're losing much, because it feels for me that both these cards have already sort of rendered themselves a lot less useful in the meta.
Yeah, Lugia, like you say, was in John Kettler's list this a couple of weeks ago, so clearly he's still felt value out of Deep Hurricane. But in general, I don't think it was too difficult a decision to make. I think Lele is a lot stronger of a card a lot of the time. And yeah, Trevenant, even though it is rotating, it's still, like you say, it kind of rotates itself simply because Dark Forest isn't anywhere near as strong as it was back in the day, or back at least before this set. So these two cards have seen play somewhat, but are kind of it's worth noting that they're rotating, but have sort of dropped out of the radar over the past few months. Next up, we have Mega Sceptile and Ariados, another Mega Pokemon. This is one of the only ones that I think could have still seen a decent amount of play had it stayed. Jagged Saber is a really, really cool attack in a format that looks to be already have issues if you're being two-shot war. If you're in a two-shot war, well, now you're healing through your attack as well. So I think it's one of the megas that maybe could have seen a little bit of play if it had stayed, but unfortunately it doesn't. It was a good counter to many water types. It had things like Forest, like we say, plus this strong attack, and there's a lot of cool little Pokemon you can pair with this. Things like Starmie is a nice partner for Mega Sceptile. The biggest problem is it can't really compete with GX level HPs nowadays. Because you have to have that Spirit Link, you can't have the Choice Band. And because you can't have the Choice Band, you're actually three-shotting some GXs, which just isn't good enough anymore. Even if you're not, even if you're tanking a hit and rotating back to a benched one, there will be a point where some decks can hit 220, or at least abuse the fact that you're only taking 3 shots on GXs. So it has seen a lot less play lately. And then Ariados was a useful little sort of splashable Pokemon that was seen in some kind of fun archetypes, even in some grass archetypes themselves. But things like Raticate Ariados and Doublade Ariados all saw sort of fun play online and things like that. So it's worth noting we don't have super reliable Insta Poison to finish things off now that Ariados leaves.
Yeah, it's gone, and as to as the Sceptile, I personally have like a love-hate relationship with Mega Sceptile. I've done well with it in the regionals, actually losing a mirror match in top 8, which was hilarious, when it was like not on the radar at all as a deck. And then I had probably my worst ever tournament experience of my life with Mega Sceptile, where it was basically me at the bottom tables having to scrape ties against like seniors just because they were playing Volk, and it's like I hit 3 Volks in a day just because I got the meta call completely wrong. And Mega Sceptile will always be a reminder to me to try not to over metagame and just play a good deck, but right now I'm still finding that a hard lesson to learn and still choosing to play rogue decks, but he's a constant reminder. But finally I can put him to bed because Mega Sceptile is a card that I keep sort of wandering back to because of that really cool ancient trait, the Theta Stop being so good against things like Decidueye and Greninja. It was something that I kind of pandered to a couple of times and didn't really pull the trigger on Mega Sceptile since that big flop tournament that I had. But it was one that I sort of would always take a couple of hours of testing time to look at once again and see how the archetype worked, and now I can just save myself that time and throw it in the binder. Also, we are losing some disruption supports. Finally, the Warlord archetype is being rotated. It did have the big old splash at Nationals, making that second place and winning a few hearts along the way. Crawdaunt as well has been a disruptive card. I remember it being in early forms of Toad-Tina, definitely in the UK. It was the most popular combo. And Crawdaunt seemed playing a couple other things as well. I believe there was a Bayonet archetype running around that had Crawdaunt as well. And Bunnelby has been a card that has won games on his own back, creating a win condition for you by milling, and also recovering some important tools. This was like pre-special charge and stuff like that, when you could get back some really important like double colorless energies and stuff like that. He's not seen a huge amount of plays recently, Bunnelby, but only really dedicated to like the Houndoom mill style decks, and it's a small loss for those sorts of mill decks, and Warlord just being a card that sits in the active and does announce pass every turn has sort of been outclassed by the likes of Lapras that can collect every turn, and by the likes of Sylveon, which can guarantee, you know, the 3 perfect cards for your next turn. But at the same time, this was in the limelight, and I know a few people who will be very sad to see Warlord go, because definitely there's been a few people who have basically rocked Warlord since it came out, and that's such a crazy thing to want to do that to yourself, but I know some people who do.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy to see these kind of uninteractive cards go. At least, like, Lapras attaches energy for you to then abuse with things like Lele and stuff. Like, Wailord was just, I think, a really, really uninteractive card to use. But then I really liked Primal Groudon, so you know what am I saying? I guess it's in the same vein as that. Crawdon, like you say, saw I think more play over in Europe and the UK than sort of worldwide play, but it's one that I wanted to at least add into the slideshow simply because it's always a card that I think about when thinking of disruption decks. And yeah, Bunnelby, because it's only got 60 HP, I think Decidueye was one of the biggest reasons why it's been pushed out of the format. It's a really, really easy bench sitting prize later on in the game, meaning that your opponent doesn't even have to attack to take that extra prize. So that's why it's only really seen in these niche full mill decks. But it was a nice little non-EX that I think me and Joe always, when we were struggling to find a non-EX in decks, we would always kind of look at Bunnelby and just think sometimes you'll have that extra win condition of discarding your opponent's last two cards and announcing the win that way. So it's a sad card to see go, but it hasn't been too playable over the past few months anyway. Next up we have Excadrill and the two Entei from Ancient Origins. Excadrill has seen a little bit more play. It's one of these stage run attackers, so paired with these evolutions, that's why this guy saw play. We have a relatively metal weak, or we've had relatively metal weak fields in the past, and this is when Excadrill has kind of popped his head out and tried to be a little bit of a counter deck. Unfortunately, Volk has always been a bit of an issue, so you have to find these specific evolutions. So it's never sort of taken off completely, but it has seen at least niche play, and we've done a couple of lists on the channel just because it's a card that I think me and Joe really enjoy playing, even if it hasn't been at the top of the tier 1 whilst it's been around. And then both Enteis have seen some play in the past. The Entei on the right was often the 2-energy attacker in Volk decks against these more awkward item locking decks, or decks that locked down your deck somewhat that you didn't want to have to attach 3 energy in a turn. You just wanted to be able to get a quick knockout through a non-EX that has 1 less energy attachment. So it saw some niche play, but now we have Turtonator. No one really thinks about Entei anymore. And then the Ancient Trait Entei actually saw play with Charizard back when we didn't have Steam Siege, so there was really no good fire Pokemon in the format. So at that point, Entei Charizard was actually a really, really cool deck that saw some play. It started in America and kind of took the world by storm when we realized there was actually a good fire deck out there. Again, hasn't seen too much play since we've had Steam Siege, simply because the Volcanion package is just a better all-round deck. But Entei definitely did take down some cities and states at the time, and I think made a decent impression whilst it was in format with Charizard EX.
Yeah, who knows? Excadrill could have its last hurrah before exiting the format, because it's a metal type, and really only Excadrill and Metagross are these are like the only metal cards we have right now that are worth looking at, I feel. And because Guardi's around, Excadrill could, be that rogue pick for Worlds that somehow makes it in to day 2 and potentially even further, probably with like Evolutions and Delmire's support, which could be hilarious. If you face enough Guardis, you could be trolling. So yeah, maybe he'll have his last hurrah. For the Enteis, I believe they've sort of been outclassed, especially when the Ancient Trait 1 loses Blacksmith. That pretty much stopped in its tracks, and also there's tool removal as well, so its trait isn't even any good anymore, but that used to be like a really good selling point for the card, because it could be really tanky with like double Assault Vest. That was really cool to see that archetype come out of nowhere, and it was very creative, so it's a shame to see these guys go as well. A few support Pokemon then. The Bayonet package is pretty cool. There was a really funny Evolution Jammer Decidueye deck that went up, did the rounds on like the Facebook groups, and that was pretty creative. I've used Blair Shop it a few times in tournaments, and that's also been fun. The Tool Concealment Bayonet never saw too much play, because it was a tool that Garbled could use to turn off the effect of Bayonet, which is quite funny. And then it gets the effect of its tool back, which is pretty troll. And then there's just a handful of ones here. Clear Humming for Altaria. It was definitely in early Ray lists because of the popularity of Raichu, but that sort of phased itself out just because it was Clunk. Flygon EX with the Voice of the Sands ability was in Rainbow Force. Ninetales, it didn't see too much play. I remember it being in a few Nationals lists in American Nats that it actually ended up seeing play in Yveltal at one point, because they wanted to play Shadow Circle to protect themselves from Mega Manectric. I remember those decks not doing too well, but I remember a small contingent of players chose to use the Ninetales in that deck, so pretty cool. And it's a card that
Raichu.
and Raichu as well, yeah.
Yeah.
And Raichu Ninetales, that was actually like still one of our most popular videos. I believe it got over 10k views.
Such a
So
good video.
shout out to that video. I remember doing dummy hands and getting like turn 1 Raichu knockouts and stuff. That was pretty cool. So a piece of OmniPoke history finally.
That's why it's on this slide. That's why I added it in.
Yeah. Absol as well. The Cursed Eyes ability has been pretty cool. It was in Shintaro's winning deck of Ordino. It's also seen play in Mega Gardy. The Maxwind Dragonite's been one that made a pretty cool version of Primal Groudon at one point, and also it can sometimes be a tech one of in the Dragon's Wish build of Darkrai Dragons, which is hilarious. And Milotic used to be a staple card in Night March, so this has actually seen a lot of play. It's also been in a few Vespiquen lists, even this season. I remember one of the regionals, I believe it was the second place list, played a 1-1 Milotic line, so even now it's seen a fair share of play, and this is probably the best card on this slide, to be honest, because at the time it was crazy good in Night March as like a solid 2-2 count, back when we had like Scoop Up originally. And now Scoop Up's back, but unfortunately this guy's gone.
Yeah, all of these are kind of Pokemon that have seen a little bit of niche play here and there, that weren't worth leaving off of the PowerPoint. Things like some of these things that weren't played at all, but we didn't sort of deserve their own slide. I don't think they haven't done enough in the format to quite warrant that. But yeah, it's worth noting that these are some Pokemon that do indeed leave. Next up, we have some item cards. Acrobike is a really, really good speed card, and it's still played in things like Vespiquen. But it's Vespiquen is one of the only decks that still plays it. There was a time where a few more decks considered it. Garbodor has pushed people away from this. I feel since we've had Lele as well, a lot of people have just gone for supporter draw rather than speedy Acrobike draw. But it's definitely a card that still sees play in Vespiquen, and for a time saw a lot of play in some of these Wombo combo decks anyway. Eco Arm was useful for getting back these Pokemon tools like Bursting Balloon. I know I played it in my International Championship list rather than the 4th Bursting Balloon. Such a fun little card to play. I didn't do very well, so maybe that means the card isn't very good. But, you know, I was playing Greninja, so maybe that means the deck isn't very good. But it's definitely a card that I think people have always considered in things when Bursting Balloon was a popular tool to play. Now we have Field Blower, though. Bursting Balloon has seen literally 0 play. So there's no reason for Eco Arm to really be all that useful. You're just better off running that 4th physical tool, in my opinion. Things like Choice Band and Floatstone, you're better off just running the 4th physical tool. Lucky Helmet was seen in some Gyarados lists just after sort of first rotation happened, and then towards the middle of the format, the middle of the rotation as well. Just taking the pressure off being your opponent ending you down in the late game, because Gyarados needs a lot of pieces to set up its second Gyarados after a knockout. Double Lucky Helmet was a really, really nice way of your opponent ending you down to 1, and then you still drawing 6 cards, because you're drawing 1 card plus 4 cards for the Lucky Helmet knockout plus a card per turn. So it actually meant you weren't hurt by N at all, considering there was no item or tool removal in the format. So yeah, that was a niche play. Saw some niche play in Gyarados. And then finally, Wide Lens has always been a card that people have thought, oh, how can we knock out Shaymins with this card, because it applies weakness to benched Pokemon. Obviously, Shaymin goes, so it's nowhere near as impactful. But it has led to some pretty creative decks. I think there's a Weavile that does things like this, and I think there's a couple of others that people have always thought, oh, we can Wide Lens plus Jolteon to kill 3 Shaymins for the game. It's just created some really, really fun archetypes.
Yeah, for me, I think Acrobike's the most impactful card. I've loved making speed engines. I remember like Lurantis Plume. I think even my latest Marshadow Plume is playing it. Even like Turbo Darkrai might play it now that you have the GX. Who knows? I think Acrobike is a cool speed card, but again, it's just another thing that we lose. So Acrobike, Male, and Shaymin all adds up to pretty much the answer that we'll have not many combo decks at all. It's going to be set up over a number of turns rather than set up in one turn and boom, there's your strategy set on the board for the rest of the game. That's just not going to be the case anymore. And the other cards, as you've said, Jack, have seen sparing play here and there. The Eco Arm in Mien Shao was super troll. I remember splashing Focus Sashes back into the deck. But yeah, sparing play for all these cards. Then there's the really, really cool Archie and Maxie's combo finally exiting the format. They had their highlights back when Battle Compressor was around. Of course, Archie was centered around a world-winning deck, the Archie Stoice archetype. And Max's Hidden Ball Trick was actually seen in a lot of different decks, particularly the Yveltal Gallade Zoroark sort of build, and still sees playing expanded for being able to recover Archeops. And it's a pretty cool card for sure. A couple of cards, and these sorts of supporters I would like to see again, because they force you to build your deck in a very specific way and reward you in a very interesting way. It's a shame that we haven't had enough support to keep these relevant in the most recent months, but they were very cool cards to play. And the Ace Trainer has been an interesting card. Again, it's another loss for Greninja, it seems. And these slower archetypes that can really punish your opponent for trying to go aggressive in the early turns. So they've had some highlights, but yeah, it's time to say goodbye to these also.
Yeah, Archie and Maxis are such interesting cards, and I really hope we see these kind of effects in the future. They're also really good decks, I think, for practicing with. They're really, really high skill decks, because getting these combos off is really, really difficult. But I think if you're able to do it and able to see these combos quicker and quicker, you're actually gonna they're really, really good. It's really, really good to have these kind of skills, even when you're not playing decks that involve Archies and Maxis. Just seeing your hand and knowing exactly what order to do things in. So they're also cards that reward skilled players as well. So this is the kind of card that I really hope they bring back in the format, and hopefully we're seeing some more creative supporters. So hopefully we are going to see some of these kind of supporters coming back at some point. And yeah, Ace Trainer, whilst I don't think it's a particular nail in Greninja's coffin, it was just only ever one, maybe niche two of. It's still another thing that they can't run that 5th N anymore. So yeah, that's kind of awkward, but nothing too impactful bar the Archies and Maxis. Next up, we have a handful of stadiums. Silent Lab is definitely the most notable one right now. Being able to lock down Lele, Shaman, Hooper, these kind of things. But Hooper and Shaman are going, so you're only locking down Lele. So actually it means that this card probably wouldn't see too much play anyway. Hitting Volk as well is useful, but again, it's not as impactful. Shrine of Memories meant that Mega Mewtwo could easily damage change, and meant that there was another trick up that deck sleeve that opponents had to play around, so that will be missed. But Mega Mewtwo pretty much is dead as an archetype anyway. Garbodor completely pushes that out, so the new Mega Mewtwo is now Gardevoir GX, so it's not really like this card was seeing play anyway. Aquabase was a card that kind of hasn't seen too much play since the last rotation with Toad going, but did see a decent amount of play in Toad Tina. It was another annoying card for your opponents to have to deal with. And then Faded Town was always decks' answers to Mega decks if they weren't able to have particularly good matchups naturally. Just throwing in a Faded Town here or there meant that sometimes you're able to get 20, even 40 in extra damage, which was enough to be able to keep up with these high cap HP on the Megas. Unfortunately, we don't have, Megas aren't seeing much play anymore. Now we have these GXs, so Po Town is kind of the new Faded Town. But yeah, Faded Town definitely was played in some decks that found it difficult to deal with these Mega matchups.
And finally, we then have just a few energy here and there. All of them haven't really seen a huge amount of play, actually. I think Flash Energy saw sparing play in Manectric Bats. That was when Lucario Bats was still a thing, but really not too much play. And that's really about it. I know a couple of Guardy players were playing Wonder Energy at the NAIC, just so they didn't get confused. But that's pretty much it. These have not really seen a lot of play, but they're no longer options for you, so just bear those in mind. Finally, we're going to start looking at how decks evolve now that we have talked about everything that has gone. What does that mean for the decks that we have remaining in the format? First of all, we'll just say goodbye to a few decks, and then we'll see what we've got left. We've got a short list of I think it's like the top 14 or so decks, and we'll talk about their impact, where they stand post rotation. And this is probably going to be the most interesting part of the video for me, at least.
So yeah, goodbye to some old friends. Gyarados, Vespiquen, and Mega Ray all lose everything in this rotation. They all lose their main attacker in these three, plus a lot of support cards anyway. So you're not going to be seeing these cards around your tables in standard tournaments anymore. They've all seen relatively good success, winning regionals, high placements at multiple regionals, even nationals back when nationals were a thing, you know. So these are archetypes that will be missed well, maybe not missed, but will no longer be seen in play in standard as of September the 1st.
So let's start looking at the archetypes that we do have, and we'll start off with Gardevoir GX, what I believe is currently the best deck in format. Let's see what it loses. Level Ball is really actually quite an important one for me, because it's really good for Octillery and Curlier, as well as finding basic Pokemon if you can't hit your Bridget. Teammates isn't often played in the deck, but it can be used if your opponent is playing an aggressive deck and go for early KOs on some of your basics. You can just teammates out like Guardy, Candy, or Octillery and something else, and it's just a really cool one-of. VS Seeker is big for like every deck, but even Guardy, thanks to its GX attack, can still recycle its own supporters, so it's probably going to get away with that. And Trainer's Mail is sparingly seen in Guardy. I don't think many lists play it, but again, it's just a consistency issue. Moving forward, thanks to Mega Rayquaza leaving and Hex Maniac also no longer being playable, this is really good for Gardevoir GX. Hex isn't really a huge issue for this deck, but it does slow it down tempo-wise. And Mega Rayquaza, pretty much either you take the loss to it or you dedicate a slot to play Sudowoodo to not lose to it. And even just gaining a slot can help you out. It's just less of a headache, and it makes your entire 60 cards a lot cleaner now that you don't have to worry about this archetype. So I think in general, as well as the fact that things like Vespiquen and Gyarados go, these awkward non-EX decks, it's really good for Guardy, because Guardy prefers taking knockouts on 2-prize attackers because it can ramp its damage so high. It's much better to face other GX and EX Pokemon. So all these things bode well for Guardy, and it's really only a few archetypes that can deal with him, in my opinion. Or her, I should say.
I think Guardy definitely is one of the best decks going into Worlds format and seems to not lose too much after September the 1st. So I'd pick these guys up now just because I think it's going to be a very solid archetype. Like we say, Level Ball is the biggest loss, so when you're not bothered about things like VS Seeker and Trainer's Mail, you know you've got a good deck anyway. So, you know, I'd say Gardevoir isn't hit too hard. Overall, probably gains from the rotation, if anything, and is definitely going to be a real force in the format coming up. It doesn't lose anything, so it's just going to get better. Next up, we have Decidueye. This loses a few more things. It loses Vileplume, Forest. That combo is, in general, just a huge loss for the deck. Losing Vileplume means that you don't really have access to... you have to play Desi Tails, or maybe another style of Desi deck rather than playing Desi Plume, because you can't have that inherent lock style deck anymore. Forest and Level Ball going means that the Stage 2 text on Decidueye is genuinely Stage 2 now, so you're going to have to run things like Rare Candy, and this is going to be more of a support role rather than being able to Level Ball out your Dartrixes, then Ultra Ball out your Decidueyes, and do it all on turn 1. Shaman was, of course, a real big combo card, and for a deck like Decidueye that had a lot of pieces to be able to ramp into these Stage 2s in the early turns, it happily ran 1 or 2. Even before Lele was released, it ran sometimes 3. So it's still a relevant card to lose, even though it's been pushed more out of format by Lele. Trevenant and Lugia, we mentioned earlier on, pretty much the same goes as to what we mentioned earlier on. They've kind of rotated themselves out anyway, but it is worth noting that both of these attackers have seen play in Decidueye, so it doesn't have as many versatile attackers just to throw into the deck anymore. And then Trainer's Mail is another combo card that sometimes people play. It's one of the most debated cards in Decidueye, I feel. Some people rave about 4, 3, 2, 1, or 0. I feel like it's a really, really wide range of how people want to play this count of Trainer's Mail. But it is a card that people will have always played in these combo style decks. So it's worth noting that Decidueye does lose Trainer's Mail as well. I think it becomes a lot less impactful on the format in the meta in general. It becomes much more of a support role, I think. I don't think you can go quad Decidueye and win with this genuinely only mediocre attack. 3 for 90 is a mediocre attack. What made this guy broken was the fact that you could start doing this from turn 2 with Feather Arrow starting turn 1 and getting multiple out turn 1. Now this is a genuine stage 2 and you're going to be looking at maybe 2 by turn 2. This Razor Leaf Feather Arrow combo is nowhere near as broken as it was. So we're going to see this as more of a Pokemon that pushes your Pokemon into one-shot range, pushes a partner into range, rather than just setting up 4 and pushing Razor Leaf into range instead.
Yeah, that's pretty much how I see the card developing. I believe Tails may survive if you go just for a thicker Ninetales line. If you go for like a 3-2 Ninetales now and really rely on that and just go for Beacon for the first like 2 turns of the game, every game, and then playing Heavy Candy, I think it maybe survives, but I think it definitely drops the tier list. Decidueye has been labelled best deck in format, and I don't think we'll ever see that post-Forest, especially because Shaman and Trainer's Mail, I believe those are like really important as well. Not quite as important as the Forest itself, but they are hugely impactful cards in the deck, for me at least. And I'm a huge fan of high mail count in Decidueye, always have been, just because it's a combo deck. And I think post-Worlds, a lot of Decidueye decks are going to... I think people will immediately just like not play the card, but I think there'll be a small contingent who try and make it work, and I believe it will still remain a deck of discussion, but won't be ever reaching the heights that it has done this season. Similarly, there's another grass archetype, Golisopod. It's weird to say that we're talking about an archetype that starts losing cards before we've even seen it in action yet in tournament play, but he too loses the Forest, which is really bad because it's a deck that, in my eyes, works great in combination with cards like Super Scoop Up and Acerola, when you can take a hit, wipe it off the board, put everything back down, and go back into your first attack using First Impression. And pretty much that entire combo, the entire shape of how it looks going into Worlds, is pretty much erased after one tournament, which is pretty sad for the archetype. Also, you lose Shaman again, just because you're trying to hit this turn 1 First Impression. You need to hit Forests, you need to find a way to move out of your active into a Golisopod, and you need to find energy. Oftentimes Shaman will help you get there, and losing things like VS Seeker as well is a generality that everything loses it, but it's also a pain for this guy in general, because you need to spam Acerolas and Guzmas, and it probably means you need to play like 3 counts at least of each of those cards now that VS Seeker goes, and that can potentially jank out your deck. So going forward, it's a lot less quick, consistent, and you can't really wombo combo anymore. You can't get turn 1 First Impressions ever anymore because we've lost Forest, unless you go for like Wally, but somehow you have to Wally, have an energy in hand, and a way to move out the active. So you pretty much have to start Wimpod and have another Wimpod on your board in your opening hand in order to go for that, whilst using a non-draw supporter. And we don't have item draw, and we don't have Shaman anymore, so you need to open with the sickest hand ever to go turn 1 First Impression, basically, now. Also of note, because Forest is going to Decidueye, which is probably a partner for Golisopod, seeing as though we've seen it do well in Japan with Shintaro, and also it loses the evolutions, which I personally am a fan of it with Golisopod. I'm yet to see many other people pair it with the EVs, but personally, from my early testing, I like it with the evolutions, at least in theory, because you can have good mirror matches, good Metagross, good Decidueye, and an answer to Volcanion. Those things seem like a lot of matchups being fixed by not many card slots, so I believe that is also a big loss for Golisopod, because it can't compete against things like Volk anymore, can't compete as well with Metagross other than just trying to early pressure them down, because you can't get the one-shots in later turns. So Golisopod, I also think, loses a lot. So if you're not going to Worlds, you may have to reconsider purchasing Golisopods. We rated it 4-star in our set review, but that was in view of Worlds, and potentially this glamorous card that is so good for Worlds may be a one-hit wonder.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I'm also not going to Worlds. It's going to mean that I'm not going to be picking Galisopods up, which is so unfortunate because First Impression is a really, really cool attack. But yeah, I don't think with Forest With Forest, it still can technically survive, but you always need double Wimpod out. And that's not always going to be easy. You can still Acerola up and then evolve your sort of Wimpod that's already been sitting on your bench. So it's still okay. It's still like a combo that you can run, but it's without Forest, it doesn't have the speed, and without Shaman, Trainer's Mail, and VS Seeker, like we say, it doesn't have the Wombo combo, being able to get into these cards quickly. So I don't think it completely dies, but I think it's a lot worse come rotation, and it's going to mean that, like I say, I probably, because I'm not going to a World, I probably won't be picking these guys up, because I think there's going to be better archetypes out there, even if they're not grass types. I think there's going to be better archetypes out there that aren't quite as awkward as having to hit physical Acerola every turn, just to be able to deal this 120 damage, which is a really big swing, really good tempo. But without EVs, you're not hitting weaknesses. There's just a lot that this card loses. So unfortunately, it may indeed be a one-hit wonder, and even if it's not a one-hit wonder, I don't think it's ever above tier 2. If it stays in the format, if that, I think that's me being generous. Next up, we have Volcanion. This is another card that actually really doesn't mind this rotation happening. Obviously, it loses things like VS Seeker and Trainer's Mail, but I think we've put VS Seeker and Trainer's Mail on pretty much all of these slides. So if you count those out for all decks, the only card this loses is Rough Seas, which isn't seeing play now anyway because we have Brooklet Hill. Rough Seas was only ever a niche use, and for decks that are poking you for a little bit of damage anyway, that's completely fine with Volcanion, because Volcanion's just hitting big numbers every turn. So it doesn't really lose any cards, and on top of that, we lose Hex. So the one of the only item locks that we have is Garbodor. We obviously do have Alolan Muck, but you can Volcanic Heat and Alolan Muck without any steam ups to get the knockout. So it's still only ever kind of one turn ability lock. It's only ever as good as a Hex was, except it's 2 cards rather than 1. Plus, you don't really want to be Lysander Stall with it, so you're going to have to Floatstone it as well, so it's similar to Garb. So at that point, you're probably better off playing a Garb variant. It's still not an amazing counter for Volcanion. So actually, Volcanion is one of the decks that I think thrives the most off of this rotation, because it doesn't lose any major cards. Obviously, VSC and Trainer's Mail are awkward cards to lose, but Volcanion has adapted to a much less item-heavy list lately anyway. So Trainer's Mail hasn't seen really any play at all, and VS Seeker is a 2 to 3 count in most Volk decks. Dropping that and just running a couple of extra physical supporters, you're going to be running 2 to 3 Guzma anyway. You can actually have some real fun with Acerola combos with Steam Up as well, which is cool. After you've Volcanic Heated, you can tank a hit, Acerola your Volcanion up, and use those 3 energy that would normally be wasted going into the discard retreating. You can then you can then Steam Up 3 times, so it doesn't even mind that it loses VS Seeker, because you're running more physical supporters anyway that also work towards your combo. So I think Volcanion is actually one of the decks that really thrives off of this rotation, and is definitely going to be a very, very hard to deal with archetype that only a couple of things are able to overcome come rotation.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a big winner from this rotation. And even though we've just been saying that grass decks are getting worse, the fire weakness is still really relevant because of Metagross. So, yeah, I think Volcanion's a big winner from this rotation, as it seems. And probably it means that more water archetypes are going to come out of the woodwork, but that's just once the format has sort of settled. So maybe in early tournaments we'll see a big showing for Volcanion post-Worlds. Next up is Espeon Garbodor. A couple of big losses outside of the usuals of Trainer's Mail and VS Seeker. It also loses the type coverage evolutions. One of the reasons why many people went from Drampa onto the Espeon was because they could play the Flareons and the Vaporeons, so that you could improve a bunch of matchups by just simply one-shotting things. But at the same time, the fire weakness is a lot less relevant now. It's again only really the Metagross that you have to worry about, but it's still a matchup that pretty much swings from being favourable to unfavourable, and that can't be good for you. The deck also loses Level Ball, which has been sparingly played in the deck because we just have Bridget anyway, and Teammates again is a pretty reliable one-of in the deck because you can dig out DCE or like Choice Band Field Blower, these sorts of combos to get into even things like Garbed or Floatstone. It's been like a pretty good one of in Espeon Garb, so it loses a few pieces here and there. The core of the deck remains the same, but it's really just what other decks lose. And on every slide so far, we've been saying Male vs Seeker, and these are all item cards. So naturally, decks are going from like a 15 item count going down to like an 8 to 10 item count. They're just gonna be like Ultra Balls, Field Blowers, Tools. That's like all that remains in decks really, other than like a few specific other cards here and there, but things like Rescue Stretchers. But it's really not item heavy anymore. Obviously, like 10 items is still a big trash avalanche, but in general, decks won't be functioning as we currently see them, and it means that Trash Avalanche gets way devalued, actually. I imagine Garbodor will still be a good card, for sure. It's not like it overnight becomes terrible, but it's not going to be like a turn 4 one-hit knockout, which we sometimes see against certain archetypes that we've been used to lately. So I believe Espeon Garbodor overall takes a hit. Personally, I don't know how good it is against Guardy. I think it's bad in my head, but I don't know the matchup for certain. If it doesn't have a good Guardy, I think the deck is redundant. If it can keep up with Guardy, maybe it can keep up in the format, but I don't really have the credentials to talk about how good the matchup is. It's very reliant on how quickly Guardy hits their Field Blowers, whilst being able to like actually use Octillery. And if Espeon Garb can get the turn 2 Garb established with Floatstone before they start evolving, it could be like a breeze for you. But I can see as it progresses into the late game and Field Blowers are actually found, I believe the Guardy should be able to overpower you as is. So it's a matchup I haven't played out enough. Just in theory, I think it's all in for the Espeon. They have to draw well to win the game, whereas Guardy just has to draw not poorly to win the game. So probably a deck that's going to be declining in play more than anything else.
Yeah, I think evolutions are quite a big hit, like you say. It's why people went off of Drampa and onto Espeon, because they're able to splash these bonus types into their deck. This whole package leaving is pretty awkward for stage 1s in general, and Garb is no exclusion. As you say, again, Trash Avalanche is also devalued because it's not this crazy one-hit in the early turns. It's going to be more of a one-hit in the late turns, which I think is where Pokemon wanted to actually place this card. It's just unfortunate that it came out a set early rather than being in Burning Shadows, that kind of thing. But either way, I think, like you say, the deck does take a hit. I also don't think the Guardian matchup is particularly good, because I think if the Espeon Garb player does get a good setup and does get this tool onto the Garb early, I think Guardy has enough swing potential in the late game to actually just be really, really passive and just do nothing until they find this Field Blower. And then as soon as they find the Field Blower, they can just go bonkers and still reach that one shot on the Espeon from out of nowhere. So I feel it is quite a bad matchup, even when, like, I think it has to be a combination of Espeon Garb drawing really well and Guardy drawing really poorly. It's probably winnable, but, you know, I think with 230 HP plus so much ramp anyway, you probably have the ability to be passive for an extra couple of turns anyway, especially as Espeon is capped at around 90 if you're only attaching 1 energy. You know, it's kind of awkward. So I think Espeon does take a hit. Espeon Garb does take a hit overall, but it'll be interesting to see. I think Garb will still be a very, very strong attacker. It's just probably going to see, like we say, a bit more of a secondary attacker rather than another option that your opponent can go for in the early game and still take some crazy prizes out of nowhere just through you playing the game how you want to play. Next up, we have Metagross, another one that's actually in kind of a similar position as Volk. Even though it's weak to Volk, it's actually not losing anything at all, really. Seeker and Trainer's Mail, again, these cards are kind of everyone's losing them, so whilst they are influential losses, everyone's in the same boat. Teammates, I think, is one of the biggest cards that it loses because it is a stage 2 deck, so having that one-off Teammates did mean that you were able to get your second Candy Metagross, or even just get your first one and get the system going, after your opponent takes a prize on that first beacon, on that first Alolan Vulpix. So it's worth noting that Teammates goes, but there's still probably enough of an engine through Lele and stuff to be able to keep this relatively consistent. And the fact it's got a really, really good, in my mind, really like it's going to be hard for Guardy to beat this deck, I think. So having a good Guardy is going to solidify its place in the format. Obviously, with that very, very good matchup, it's going to have a very, very bad matchup in Volk. You'll see a little bit later on. We may be looking at a bit of a trio, kind of rock paper scissors style format, but that's okay for now. That's kind of always how rotations look going into them from the outside, and that's when we see some of these other decks pop in and out. So it's kind of where we're expecting it to be. Again, also Hex and Flareon both leaving means that Metagross just has so many less counters. Hex was one of the biggest deals for Metagross, meaning that if you hexed, they couldn't respond with a Giga Hammer next turn and just keep doing this cycle of Giga Hammer retreat, Giga Hammer retreat. So that going is really, really awkward. And Flareon meant that there were a few decks that were able to overcome this 250 HP, this huge HP that Metagross has. You know, Volk will always be able to do it, but having no more Flareon means that there's going to be really no splashable stage 1 attackers that can actually deal with Metagross in an easy way.
Yeah, I think Metagross has to worry about a lot less. Basically, if they flip over a Volcanion, you're sad. Otherwise, you're pretty happy because it'll have the time to set up a lot more now. And yeah, it hits for weakness on one of the best decks in the format. So Metagross, if anyone have picked them up, they go from being like that one regionals second place finish to potentially a lot more top cuts, a lot more frequently. So if you got your Metagrosses cheap, well done to you, because it's probably going to raise in value in the future. Next up we have Turbo Darkrai. It loses Versus Seeker and Trainer's Mail. Guess what? And it also loses Hex, which was sometimes not even played in Turbo Dark. So again, this feels like an archetype that pretty much loses nothing. Moving forward, you know, it didn't lose much, so it's just as it was. And this again feels like one of the only fast decks remaining in the format. It feels like with the GX, with Elixirs, it's one of the, you know, it's an all basic deck. I think it's only really this, Volk, and Aquabox that are like the pace setters, really. Especially because Galissapod gets so much slower. So these are the fast archetypes that we have, back to like Elixir basics, really. And especially if we feel that Garbodor's devaluing in play, it opens the floodgates for people to play items all over again. So could be pretty cool to see Turbo Darkrai. It's still a fan favorite. It's still super consistent and pretty good as a tempo sort of snowbally deck. So I believe it'll remain pretty much where it is, if not better, depending on how impactful the GX is and how they can compete with Mega Guardy. Sorry, not Mega Guardy, Guardy GX. If they can compete with Guardy, the deck will stay around. Again, it's one of these things that I've not theoried out enough. You have a lot of turns to attach a lot of energy. So I think you can ramp quite high. It just depends, again, on the timing of Guardy when they hit their field blowers, how awkward it is for you to ever get a one hit, if you can or not. It feels like you rarely ever will get a one shot, because I remember when I used to play Mega Guardy, that 210 HP plus resist was very rare that they'd get a one hit on you unless you've drawn poorly for a few turns. So it feels like it would be the case here, other than the fact that you have the GX to try and ramp you a little bit quicker. So maybe just early prize trade is enough, like Guzmering up Octillery turn 2. These sorts of players can keep you in the game, but at the same time they even have the Gallade, and if you're not ready to respond on Gallade, you like lose the game instantly. So again, Guardy, we just have to keep going back to that card because it can beat so many things just because how incredible the card is. So Turbo Darkrai, it's definitely one that people will test early on in the format. But whether or not it can stand up to Guardy is basically the tipping point of whether or not it'll actually see play.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's one of these decks that remains unchanged. Pretty much every set that comes out, it just adapts. It's never... it's an archetype in my mind that, because fighting is such a redundant type right now, it will always be just Turbo Dark. It will always adapt to the meta. There was like 2 or 3 weeks after Guardians Rise and it was out released that people were like, oh, Turbo Darkrai's dead. And it adapted. It runs 15 energy now. So, you know, it's just one of these decks that will always just change to fit the meta around it. Doing maths in my head, you need 10 energy on board to one shot with a choice band, a Guardi, which is a big commitment. 10 energy isn't easy, but is easier now we have the GX. So maybe it can get there again. We've just got to see how well we can draw as the Darkrai player. But yeah, it doesn't regarding rotation in general, it doesn't lose anything that other decks don't really. It's just got to adapt the way everything else has, which I think Darkrai is a deck that always will be able to do, because the theory behind the deck is so simple. It's just jam energy onto your board and announce Dark Pulse each turn. So it's always a deck that I think will be able to adapt to the format. The biggest issue will indeed be whether Guardi's resistance plus massive HP is enough for this deck to be pushed out of the format completely, sort of once and for all. Next up, we have Drampa Garbodor, the other big Garbodor variant in format right now. Biggest losses, VS Seeker. Team Maga's secret base is actually a relevant one for Drampa, but indeed, as we mentioned earlier on, Potown probably is a slightly better replacement anyway, because you're going to be able to abuse these evolution decks anyway, so it's probably not a bad replacement. It's going to mean that you need a different combo of cards in your hand rather than an extra basic. You're going to need to be able to evolve one of your basics on turn 2. But that being said, it's just the same amount of cards, just a different set of cards, so it's probably no better or worse on your side of the board. And if you're playing against an evolution deck, it's probably better for you to have Potown rather than Magma's base. So yeah, it's probably overall, whilst it's a big loss, it's probably countered anyway. And then Teammates, a card that again has seen a little bit more play as of late, just to be able to guarantee a second Berserk after your first Drampa goes down, or start hitting these things like Field Blower to push Trasher Launch into one-shot range a turn earlier than your opponent was expecting. It's not a huge loss, but I think it's still a loss that Garbodor would like to have Teammates, just to be able to grab these extra combo cards to be able to start Trasher Launching that turn earlier than opponents would expect. Like we say, Potown probably is the Berserk activator now, which again is really, really useful. But because we are losing a lot of items, the biggest thing is being able to see whether Drampa is enough of an early game attacker to get you into the late game where Garb can take these final 2 or 3 prizes for you. I think Drampa probably is a better Pokemon to do so compared to Espeon. But again, you're attaching 3 energy onto Drampa, so Guardi is just going to eat you up. So maybe even Drampa isn't enough for Garbodor to be able to see play in that way, which is kind of not, I don't want to say unfortunate, because we don't know that Garbodor is going anywhere, but Garbodor may in general just have to sack off both Espeon and Drampa as partners and find a new way of dealing with this early game and being able to get into this Trash Launch value in the late game, because it looks like Trash Launch isn't going to be anywhere near as oppressive as it once was, with no more VS Seeker, Acrobike, Ball cards, Trainer's Mail, all of these high impact cards that are in the format right now.
Yeah, pretty interesting. I feel if Drampa is to survive, it'll actually be similar to a list that we posted with elixirs, and you go aggressive Drampa quickly and try and get one-hit KOs this way, and even playing just like a thin line of Garbodor, maybe it even goes to like a 2-1-1 split, maybe as low as that, because Trash Launch will still find value in some matchups, but much less than previously. Drampa's still a good attacker, still consistent with its big wheel. Righteous Edge still is annoying for a couple of archetypes, but as you say, it's just a big question of Guardi. Potown can help you push it into range, but at the same time, they're going to be playing Field Blowers, and the Garbodor's never a late game option for you because they have their GX attack, so it's really down to Drampa whether or not he can take early enough prizes on lower forms and then expect itself to fall behind, and if it can withstand like ends plus a big knockout, and whether it can respond or not. I feel personally it probably can't. So maybe Drampa even finds its way with a new partner. Maybe Garbodor makes way for, like a tech metal type Pokemon, for example, just for the sake of it. I was thinking maybe even the Steam Siege Bishop could be a card that you play with Drampa. You go early Berserks, you set up Bishops on the bench, and Bishop can respond on a Gardevoir if you've had one Potown activation at any point in the game, which is pretty cool if you have Choice Band. It's weird that a metal type doing a revenge attack still can't one-hit KO a Guardi. It's just such a big mon. It's crazy. But yeah, maybe that's the way Drampa survives. For me, a big question mark is on Garbodor. Everyone's been so in love with Trashalanche. It feels weird for me to be like devaluing it and saying it's not as good as it used to be. Maybe it is still good enough. I'm not sure, but I feel like naturally there's going to be like 6 item slots that become non-item slots now in like almost every deck. So for me, it's just like a big loss for Trashalanche in general, and the fact that Guardi will see a ridiculous amount of play, can play items and then get rid of them all, or sorry, recycle them all, just puts you back down to 0. It's pretty crazy. So I think Drampagab again is an archetype that will struggle to survive unless it finds ways to answer the likes of Guardi and maybe moves the emphasis away from the Trashalanche itself and really just relies on the ability lock Garb to stabilize a couple of awkward matchups. Next up we have Vikavolt Tapu Bulu. This loses again, not much. Hexmaniac was only really played sparingly, not in every list. Same for Teammates, we've mentioned it a couple of times. You lose an early prize, you get yourself Candy Vika, and then you get going. But again, when Hexmaniac is gone, this just spells great news for Vika Bulu. And we've also mentioned that Decidueye and Gliscopod are getting much worse, and Vespiquen leaves the format. That pretty much leaves Tapu Bulu as like the only relevant grass type that we have in the format right now, other than like Lurantis, and even that gets worse. So yeah, Bulu is the front runner as a grass type, and he may find his way in this weird sort of triangle where we've got Volk being good against Metagross, Metagross being good against Guardi. Then there's going to be like the Laprases and the Greninjas that want to counter things like the Volk, and then Bulu ends up coming in here to deal with the grass weak Pokemon. So he has something to show for himself for certain. The archetype, when you can't Hex, is just really, really good. I still love this archetype, and I think it's a really strong one. I think it's also got quite a good Volk matchup as well. I think it's at least 50-50, if not better. I know Volk may be going back to heavier Elixir builds because Garbodor's less powerful, and they lose things like Trainer's Mail anyway, so you just have the slots for Elixirs, so maybe it's just 50-50, but I feel Strong Charge is just so broken, and when you can't answer Vikavolt other than Lysander KOing it, or Guzma KOing, I guess now is the new phrase, that it's just, you know, the path is paved for this card to be good. 210, it's weird that that's not enough damage sometimes anymore. Maybe we need to start playing Kukui so that we can KO Guardi in this list, but other than that, that's really about it. I think the archetype is still really solid going forward.
Yeah, it's another of these archetypes that doesn't lose really anything major, doesn't lose a big combo piece, plus really appreciates Hex going, so I think it's probably only going to get better. It's weird that Bulu, being a grass type, actually has a fairly decent Volk, but that's how strong no weaknesses is. So yeah, you know, it's an archetype that isn't going to change too much. It's going to minus the same amount of cards, plus 1 or 2, same as every other deck, and still doesn't lose anything major. So I think it's definitely going to be a tier 2. I would be surprised if it wasn't at least tier 2, just because of how strong Charge is, and being able to have this versatile attacker in Tapu Bulu. Next up, we have Greninja, a deck that I'm not completely sold on post-rotation, but I'm sure Joe will persuade you otherwise. I'll talk a little bit less than this, because I know Joe is a little bit more fond of this post-rotation. Biggest losses, VS Seeker and Mail, of course, but then Level Ball, Dive Ball, Repeat Ball, all of these cards are... This is like the 7 ball cards that Greninja runs, right? So how does it find its pieces? Well, we do have other ways of doing so. So it's not like this completely kills the deck dead. It's just going to have to adapt. It's going to have to find a new way to be able to get this turn 2 Frogadier, be able to get these multiple Greninjas out once you've had this cheat turn of getting multiple Frogadiers out. And then Rough Seas is another notable card. Once you've got into these 170 HP monsters, being able to heal 30 off them every turn, actually makes them really, really difficult to deal with. Crazy that 170 isn't that insane of a number anymore, but against things like Guardy, when you're bouncing your energy back to hand, it's going to mean that they need 6 energy on them to be able to one-shot you, and you're always going to be able to snipe away their little dudes on the bench. Maybe you even run sort of devolution package now to be able to just set up a few snipes around and then devolve decks that you find particularly difficult that are evolving out of your sort of range. It's gonna have to adapt, but I think it could still do it. I think me and Joe have always said when talking about Greninja, it will always find a way of making its way into the format, pushing its way, Giant Wall shirking all over the place. So it'll probably be there. The list is just gonna have to adapt to take this loss from the level ball, dive ball, repeat ball, or leaving the format. But the other big thing is grass decks seem to be struggling. Bulu is one of the only ones around, and you probably lose to Bulu anyway because even if you didn't have weakness, they could one-shot you. And then if they can just do it turn after turn. It's actually one of the decks that doesn't find hitting Greninja breaks hitting 180 on a Greninja break too difficult. Provided you're both stage 1 decks, but their attacks are kind of more useful for them. They've also got like the healing option as well. But the grass, like grass archetypes in general, get a lot worse with this rotation. So whilst it loses a lot of consistency, it actually gains a lot more positive matchups. So people will break out with Greninja and find a way of doing so. It's just how the list adapts to be able to accommodate for these losses.
Yeah, matchups is the key word for me. I think looking at what we've said, either loses nothing or, if anything, gains things, Greninja can be very good against Metagross, Volk, and Mega Guardy. It is, alongside Garbodor, Shadow Stitching becomes the ability lock of choice. It's something that everyone forgets, that Greninja's ability lock is a factor, and it's one of the biggest factors of the format now that we don't have Hex. To keep some of these ability-reliant Pokemon in check. So I think the fact that it is unanswered or like guaranteed ability lock when you start attacking, that's incredible. And I think Greninja's one of these decks that it's so inconsistent now and still sees so much play, even in a format where Decidueye was... It's always been in the top 3 decks, in my opinion. I don't think it's ever fallen from the top 3, basically since Internats. So, like, if people are crazy enough to play it then, surely people will be playing it when it has great matchups on paper. And for me, there are replacements out there. There's Evo Soda, there's Timer Ball, there's Brooklet Hill. People are just going to play the subpar cards and just accept the fact that your deck is even worse than it has been previously, but because the opponent opposite you is more worried about Greninja, it doesn't matter. You're under a lot less pressure than you used to be because you don't have to worry about the Vespiquens, the Decidueyes, the Glissopods that you have to worry about for Worlds. So I think Greninja, the path is open for it. As long as you can, set up 2 of your 3 games in a good matchup, that's all it needs to be. So, yeah, welcome back to really awkward, rubbish, Froakie pass turns for the big dreamers who want to get into this Giant Wall Shuriken and start having dominant board states against everything else. And remember, this also gains Guzma from the new set, so if you live the dream and get 3 breaks out, you can actually do 180 with pre-attack. So, yeah, that's pretty cool.
Goodbye, Lele.
Next up is Alolan Ninetales. It loses, again, just a couple of things. Diveball and Rough Seas are the only unique things that it loses. Diveball hasn't even been played in the most recent list at the North American Internationals, and Rough Seas is only a 1 or 2 count, so I'm definitely certain that Alolan Ninetales can survive. It gains the non-GX Ninetales as well from Burning Shadows, and potentially, now that Hex is rotating, that archetype sort of branches off as a separate archetype, a separate entity altogether to Alolan Ninetales GX, because now it becomes the new Pyro archetype, where you just have this annoying ability that people have to have answers to, and it's such a really good ability, stops EX and GX Pokemon, right? That it just overarcs on so many archetypes. Look back at these slides that we've just been talking about. How many of them have been EX and GX Pokemon? Pretty much all of them have had their main attacker at the very least being a GX Pokemon in some regard, or an EX. It's only like Greninja that hasn't been so far, and like Vikavolt having to attack sounds terrible for you. So, you know, this sort of archetype of Pyroar, quote unquote, now it's Water Pyroar, I guess, just sounds really good to me. I feel it will be a contender for sure, post-rotation. And it's annoying that there are these sorts of archetypes where people win because they set up a stage 1 and the opponent just doesn't have an answer in their deck, but it's a factor. It's something that we have to bear in mind now. And for the Alolan Ninetales deck itself, like, if you want to keep the GX route, I don't know how good it's going to be, because there's going to be hype around Metagross. There's going to be people trying to counter Guardy, and if they're doing that via weakness, Ninetales gets caught in the crossfire because it was also weak to Metal. So I think, more than anything else, there's going to be a flip-flop. Right now, going into Worlds, I believe there'll be a high GX count and 1 or 2 non-GX Ninetales, and then post-rotation we'll see 3 non-GX and maybe 1 GX Ninetales in the lists, and it's going to become much more defensive and much more annoying to play against, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a deck that I think is just going to have to adapt. We're going to see times where the non-GX is better, and then times where in this rock, paper, scissors format, when Metagross is the one of the 3 that isn't really played at the moment, that's when Ninetales is going to really thrive. I don't think it really changes. It's not a deck that is insane right now, but can do well, and again, that's how I see it post-rotation. It's not a deck that will be absolutely bonkers, even though it doesn't lose anything, but it will have potential to do well in tournaments if you just hit that right tournament where Metagross isn't quite the right pick because everyone's off of the Guardy train because everyone thinks, oh, everyone's playing Metagross, so let's play something else. If you over metagame and don't play Metagross, that's where Ninetales is going to come through. Ice Path is still an insanely strong GX attack. It's one of the best GX attacks I think we've seen. So, you know, there's definitely potential in this card, I think. It's just got to hit the right tournaments. I wouldn't be surprised if this still does well post-rotation, provided people have the right timing for this card. Next up, we have Aquabox. Much less grass in the format means that I think Aquabox comes back as a whole, as an archetype on the whole. It loses quite a few things, which is awkward. VSC Trainer's Mail, obviously, but things like Dive Ball and Rough Seas regarding water types specifically make the deck a little bit clunkier and mean that you can't quite tank as well. But with Choice Band being released anyway, plus Field Blower, it kind of means that the deck took a hit on the tanky side in the last set anyway, so maybe you just go for a more aggressive build nowadays anyway. You also lose Articuno and Regice, 2 Pokemon that have always been splashed as one-ofs into these Aquabox style decks just for specific matchups. Regice isn't too relevant because we're moving more towards a GX format rather than an EX format, but Articuno has been able to steal extra prizes here and there, and even steal games here and there against some of these little non-EX or GX Pokemon, these little 60 HP stage 1s, basics, and that kind of thing. Taking those extra prizes. Also Shaman, a minor card, nothing insane, but it's another card that the Aquabox deck will lose. However, like I say, because there's much less grass in format, it's going to mean that there's going to be a lot less auto losses around the room. Plus, this is one of the best answers to Volk because you have a relatively high HP, plus you're always one-shotting Volks. So, you know, you're gonna have outs to Volk. So if you're able to counter one of the best decks in format, it's going to naturally see some play. You have a bit more of an awkward time against things like Metagross and Guardy because you're stacking quite a few energy a lot of the time. But having that auto answer to Volk means that if you're seeing 2 or 3 Volks in a day, that's 2 or 3 auto wins. So as long as you don't hit too many of these awkward matchups, you can guarantee things like top 32s just by having a good consistent deck that has a strong matchup against one of the best decks in format.
Yeah, it feels like it's got a few good matchups, a lot less grass around, and similar to like Turbo Darkrai, where it's just going to be quick basics that just plays elixirs so it can tempo out on things. I think Articuno is probably the biggest loss, so it can't tempo out on like Greninjas and other evolving decks. Like, again, we have to keep going back to Guardy. It's going to be a hard matchup for you, but There you go. It's a hard matchup for everyone, but I still feel Aquabox will see more play thanks to the lack of grass types. Next up is Noivern. It loses DDE. That's really, really bad for the deck, and it means that you can't play the Acerola Scoop Up combo, and I think that's probably one of the strongest things about it going into Worlds, and it also can't play the Wally combo, so it's always a turn 2 item lock at best if you're going first. So I feel Noivern might only see a glimpse of play at Worlds, maybe even not then, thanks to its awkward fairy weakness, but I don't think it'll see a huge amount of play post-rotation either until we see that DDE return.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a pretty quick slide for Noivern, just because DDE is the card that sort of is the nail in the coffin for this deck. Until we do get a DDE reprint, like we say, I think me and Joe both expect it within at some point. But until we see that reprint, if we do get it, I think Noivern is unfortunately one for the binder. Next up, we have Zoroark Drampa, an archetype that again has seen quite a lot of play recently, but it's not doing too well post this rotation either. Loses VS Seeker as always, and Magma's base. Obviously, we've mentioned how Magma base can be replaced. Teammates, again, very similar to Drampa Garbodor, is a nice card to have, especially as it's DCE reliant on the other attacker rather than just being a single energy on Garb. So it's a bit more useful in this deck. And also Hex Maniac is, of course, a useful card to be able to have in the deck, and it's going to be awkward to not have this auto ability lock going into your opponent's turn. That's a real issue, I think, for the deck. The archetype is going to struggle against Guardy anyway, but with Greninja and Metagross both looking better, in better standing with no Hex in the format, this is another 2 awkward matchups for the deck. So even though I think Zoroark and Drampa are both very, very strong cards, it may not be immediately after rotation, it may not be the right time for Zoro Drampa to carry on sort of countering some of these top tier decks that it has been over the past few weeks.
Yeah, I think you're pretty much nailing it. The deck sort of sprang up because it could counter 1 or 2 of the more popular archetypes, and now those archetypes are sort of dropping off. It's getting a lot more awkward ones. Gardevoir GX being so popular, this doesn't really have the tools to win against it, I don't think. Greninja and Metagross additionally are really awkward. It doesn't lose anything severe in terms of a rotation, it's just the fact that things are changing around it, there are so many moving pieces in the metagame, it just finds itself in a much more awkward position because it doesn't have the matchups that it used to have. Next up we have Mega Gardevoir. We already alluded to this when we talked about Mega Rayquaza much earlier on in the video, but losing Shaman EX and Mega Turbo are incredibly difficult losses to take. Also, the Sky Field is really important for Despair Ray's damage output. Now you're only ever 2-shotting things, and that's really quite bad because you can be 1-shot in this meta when 210 HP isn't enough. It's a pretty sad state of affairs. The 2 types that you have aren't too fantastic either. That was one of the reasons why Mega Guardy was so good. Hitting for like Psychic Weakness and Fairy Weakness has been relevant previously, and it just feels like that's a lot less so the case. It's pretty awkward. I feel pretty much Guardy is done for. Now that Hooper can't get you crazy amounts of draw, can't get you cycling into your pieces, you need so much to get going as a Guardy player, and Shaman is pretty much the crutch of the deck. It's a 4 of, and you play Dragonites to reuse them even more so. That I feel that Guardy, even though itself isn't rotated, pretty much every other Pokemon and the stadium, it's just so much support around the deck that is, the deck can't function without these sorts of pieces, I feel.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but I think the Despair Ray is finally done for, at least until we see something similar in support, and it needs to be essentially Skyfield and Shaman being reprinted, so, it's probably in the binder for the near future, if not the rest of its time in the format. So that is all of the decks we want to talk about specifically. This is just a quick summary page. As you can see, Decidueye, Vileplume, Zorodrampa, and Mega Guardy probably drop out off the radar completely because they either lose very important cards or the matchups get so bad that you'd never run this. You'd never run the deck over a different deck instead. Decidueye, other variants of Decidueye, Golisopod, Drampagab, and Noivern will probably decrease in play simply because they lose too much, or don't have amazingly good matchups. They still probably have the inherent power to be able to win a multiple rounds in a big tournament, but they don't have enough to be able to quite reach high level play anymore. Espeon Garb, Darkrai, Greninja, and Aquabox all kind of stay where they are at best. Some will improve, some will slightly improve, some will slightly get worse, but they're all going to be relatively unchanged. Guardy GX, Volcanion, Metagross, Vika Bulu, these are all archetypes that pretty much all completely appreciate hex rotating and therefore are all going to see even more play. And then finally, Alolan Ninetales is the one outlier here that probably completely changes as a deck, but still stays under the Alolan Ninetales category, just because we get a new sort of branch of this deck to see kind of where this deck goes. I think most of the other decks on the list stay pretty similar to how they are. Maybe Decidueye could debatably have a plus sign next to it because it's probably not going to be a Decidueye.deck anymore. But, you know, that's kind of, in general, where we're seeing this rotation take these archetypes that are doing well in the format right now.
Yeah, for sure. I think the most debatable ones here are, as you said, the Decidueye, the non-plume builds, where that ends up being is pretty much one that we can't really foresee. We need to see how impactful it is that Forest is gone, and if it can be Metagross-esque, where you go for a Beacon Candy engine. Because it's not hard for Metagross to get like 3-4 Metagross out in a game. So maybe it's all a lot of panic for nothing, and Decidueye can continue pretty much just taking the 4 slots of Forest and making them rare candies. Like, the spaces isn't an issue, it's just the fact that the deck becomes a lot less oppressive on the early turns. You can't have those Shaman combo turns and getting 1 or 2 Decidueyes out. It becomes a lot more of a mid-rangey, slower deck that is trying to place counters and cash in on them in a much later date, and it's still one of the best decks in format that we have that can abuse Espeon EX, and I still think Espeon EX is like crazy good in this meta. Just looking at the list of decks that you can see right now, look how many evolutions are on there. So yeah, Decidueye may even remain top tier, who knows. It's one that I need to figure out, and I think the other deck that's more controversial for me, at least, is Greninja. I think Jack is the one making me say, no, Greninja gets so much worse because the Ball Search gets so much worse, but I think in a vacuum the deck is worse, but in the metagame it just gets a huge plus sign next to it, in my opinion. So for me, I think Greninja becomes pushed again into one of the higher decks to be concerned about and to be worried about. At the same time, there is the 1-card answer to Greninja. I think the Giratina promo remains. Pretty sure it does,
Yeah,
right?
it definitely does.
Yeah, so people can still have the 1-of answer to Greninja if need be. I remember the Japanese Gardevoir GX list played one of those, so here we are going crazy about Greninja, and if ever that's the case, people are going to start teching in the answers to Greninja, and they can't even play Silent Lab anymore to turn off the Giratina that's little basics ability. So maybe Greninja remains sort of where it is right now, where it'll see, you know, like less than 5% of play in tournaments, but will sometimes make these breakthrough runs where they just hit the right matchups and not enough people are choosing to play this tech card because they just want to go for consistency instead. Right, again, it's one of these videos that we've rambled on for a whole lot of time. So if you've remained here, thanks so much for watching. I'm sure all of you dedicated fans will know where to find us on the Facebook, on the Twitter, on Twitch as well. We stream weekly on a Wednesday from 8:15 p.m. due to midnight, and sometimes even later than that if we're still playing games or if we're in a deep discussion. On the Facebook you can see some lists and also a few updates from us based on like tournaments, big tournaments that we go to. Sometimes we lay out how we're doing in there. And the Twitter is also good just to keep up to date when we need to do news flashes of things. The Twitter's also great to get involved with. We're trying to be more active on the Facebook and Twitter as we go, but definitely Twitch is probably the best one for you to keep an eye out on because the streams are a whole lot of fun and you get to interact face-to-face with us and ask us questions, which we love, and hopefully you guys can get some answers from us. about things that you otherwise couldn't fit all down below in a little comment, which of course you can still use. The comment section is there for a reason. Get involved with this discussion. Where do you think everything places in the new meta game? Definitely one that a lot of people debate on what's good post-rotation. I feel like it's a really healthy discussion to have, and one that I feel plenty of people see it differently to me and to Jack as well. So even me and Jack have debated it thoroughly and questioned lots of things amongst ourselves, and normally we're fairly similar in our opinions of things. So I'm sure you guys have a lot to debate as well. So get it all down below. Regardless if you agree with everything we've said or not, still leave a like this video because it took us a long time to get prepared. This time Jack made the slides. As you can see, it looks a lot more professional than the ones I normally make. So there you go. That's all from me.
Yeah, and finally, take a quick head over to flipsidegaming.com and use the discount code OmniPoke in all caps. If you're ordering over $10 worth of stuff, you can get 10% off that latest order. So make sure you go and check them out. For all of your post-rotation needs, if you want to pick up some of these cards early, get in before some of these other, well, before rotation actually hits, try and get some cheap deals. Definitely go out and check them out. But yeah, other than that, thank you very much for watching. It's goodbye from me, goodbye from Joe, and goodbye from Shaman, unfortunately. We're going to be seeing no more Shamans after September, so it's going to be goodbye from all of us this time. Thank you very much for watching, and we look forward to seeing you guys in another video.